UFOs and Aliens today with Micah Hanks on the Universal Learning Series radio show. I'm your host, Sandy Andrew. Welcome. One of the chapters in the book UFOs and Aliens is based on an interview Micah Hanks had with a former Army security officer named Stephen. While stationed on Johnston Atoll in 1988, he and several hundred witnesses observed a gigantic circular UFO that appeared and hovered directly overhead just before dawn on the morning in July of that year. Then, as the sun broke over the horizon, the gigantic UFO simply vanished. Stephen suspects that what he and the others on the island, including a retired two-star general, witnessed was an extraterrestrial craft experiencing some kind of malfunction that allowed them to see it hovering over them for a short period of time. This event remains one of the top 3 most incredible UFO stories. Micah Hanks has been featured as a guest on many television and radio programs, including History Channel's Guts and Bolts, Travel Channel's Weird Travels, CNN Radio, and the Jeff Rense program. Good morning, Micah. Welcome to the Universal Learning Series radio show.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Could you do the audience a huge favor and tell the story of Stephen straight from scratch, how it all came about?
Absolutely. I have to say again, among all the UFO stories that I've ever been told, and I've certainly been told a lot, this is certainly one of the most interesting, one of the most intriguing, and I thought it was therefore very fitting for this new anthology that I've contributed to, Exposed, Uncovered, and Declassified UFOs and Aliens, that New Page Books has put out. I'm so glad to be a part of that and lend this strange and intriguing and also insightful story, and it goes as follows. It was a couple of years ago. I've worked off and on in radio myself for a number of years, and at the time I was filling in as a guest host on my good friend Joshua Warren's radio program, Speaking of Strange, that airs Saturday nights in western North Carolina and throughout the Southeast. And that particular evening, as I often would do anytime I'm doing a program, whether it be my own program or I'm filling in for someone else, I tend to like to take the conversation in the direction of UFOs because it's something that, a surprising number of people, not just in the Americas, but elsewhere around the world, it's a surprising number of people that you'll find who have experienced something firsthand with this phenomenon. And the evening in question, there was a man who called in and told of a vivid encounter with a large black triangular-shaped object in the part of western North Carolina where I actually live now, literally, that was viewed over the very mountain and valley that I now reside in. But following this call, the call had taken place, I think this was 2009 or 10 when the interview was being conducted, and the individual had seen this in the summer of 1988. Another caller called in right afterward, and he said, what was the significance of 1988? I was just tuning in, and I didn't hear the entire story there. We told this individual, 1988 was the year that this individual, the previous caller, had seen this UFO, a very large black triangular object, flying silently over western North Carolina. And the man in question said, well, this is a fantastic night because I've got a similar story. It took place in the same year, 1988. He said that he had been a military police officer who was stationed on an island called Johnston Atoll. And essentially, Johnston Island, sometimes is how it's called. And that summer in 1988, he'd been stationed there. There's a bit of history with regard to the island, the atoll. It's in the Pacific Ocean. It was a military base that was on the island. I don't think it's any longer in use. And in fact, I think the island may be up for sale. There was, as I understand correctly, there was a military prison that was active on the island at the time. There'd been some, different kinds of projects and things that had taken place, and there'd been a storage facility on the island. And back in the 1960s, there had been a number of tests that had been conducted there at Johnston Atoll that involved missile technology, specifically the PGM Thor 17 missile. And there'd been a launch from Johnston Atoll where one of these missiles had been launched up into space or near space and had been detonated. They detonated one of these warheads there directly into space, and what ended up happening, this was called Operation Starfish Prime, under a larger series of operations called Operation Dominique, I believe. Starfish Prime resulted in what was called an electromagnetic pulse that literally knocked out some of the electrical infrastructure as far away as Hawaii, Honolulu, and some of those areas there on Hawaii and the islands surrounding. So that was back in 1962, but it kind of brought us into the forefront of what we know today as a very legitimate threat to infrastructure around the world. It's EMP, and the notion that any enemy nation of anywhere around the world might launch a nuclear device, not at a city or something like that, but into space, and cause this electromagnetic pulse, which would result and which would literally thrust downward, and the energetic potential could knock out the electrical infrastructure and make things very difficult for us. It could literally potentially thrust any country, even country as large as the United States, into the dark ages. So there's a lot of history about this island, Johnston Atoll. And in 1988, the morning in question, Stephen, the second caller who'd called in and talked about being stationed on the island that summer, described coming in from a night shift there. He was coming in, it was just before dawn on the morning in question. He said it was July or August of that year. And this object could be seen in the sky. Now, in the early morning light, there wasn't even really sunlight. The sun hadn't broken over the horizon yet, but he said there on the island, literally the highest point elevation-wise on the island was 4 feet above sea level. And he said that there was literally no sunlight just yet, just kind of that early pre-dawn light. And therefore, he couldn't tell if this object was metallic or if it was just very dark or maybe just black. He said it almost seemed to absorb light, but it started very small, perhaps higher up in the sky. And he said that because of the way it absorbed light, it was difficult to tell whether it was getting larger or if it was descending. But whatever happened, this object appeared to be getting closer and closer and filling up more and more space directly overhead above the island. Well, he and his company began to radio to their superiors there on the island, and he'd said that there had been a decorated gentleman this morning entertained at one of the officers' stations there on the island. And his superiors radioed to him and said, "Do you see this thing?" And they said, "Yes, sir, we do." And the radar control station there on the island said that they couldn't, quote-unquote, paint it. They couldn't detect it on their radars. So Stephen and his company said that whatever this thing was, we just hoped that it had good intentions because we were, but pretty badly equipped for trying to, take on something should it decide to engage in any kind of hostile maneuvers. And they couldn't identify it. They didn't know what it was. It was just a large, dark, round object. Well, it appeared and it kept getting larger and larger and larger and taking more and more space over the island. And literally, at some point, he said that this radio silence fell over. When the radios just moments before had been buzzing and people had just been, freaking out, literally trying to deal with this. What are we going to do? What is this thing? We can't detect it with radar, but we can all see it. We all have a visual. What is it? Who is it? More importantly. He said that eventually the radio silence just kind of, took over. People had stopped communicating. The radios were working fine, but people were just in awe. They had literally nothing to say, and they all just kind of were locked in this gaze with this object above, wondering what's going to happen. Where's it going to land if it tries to touch down? And Stephen said that the moment that the sun broke over the horizon, that sunlight struck the object and it vanished completely. He said that he got this distinct impression that although the object had been there, and might still be there, that there had been some sort of a malfunction or some other sort of a process that allowed this object to disappear in the direct presence of sunlight. Now, that may or may not be the case. That's speculation because we don't know what this craft was. I've spoken with a number of experts about it, including Stanton Friedman, who I interviewed for the contribution that I gave to this anthology that deals with this story. It doesn't... Anyone, you myself, or anyone else, Sandy, who, has heard and has any interest in UFO stories and things like that, this doesn't sound like a conventional aircraft, something that's large. I mean, literally, potentially a mile or larger in width based on the witness description. This thing was very large. It was very dark. It's circular. And didn't appear to be anything that was a known conventional craft. And then it just vanished the moment that the sunlight struck it. So we're left with a number of questions, but of course, and I guess we'll get more into this later in the interview, it kind of hints at the idea that if indeed there are UFOs proposed extraterrestrial craft or craft from any other place that are not manned and piloted by human beings, then do they have some sort of very advanced cloaking technology and an ability to literally render themselves invisible? And if so, how does that work? So that's essentially the story.
Well, thanks very much for that background story there, Micah. It certainly is one of the most incredible stories I've read. When I read your contribution in the anthology, UFOs and Aliens, Is There Anybody Out There?, I thought to myself, there must be somebody out there after this event. I mean, it literally stunned me when I read it. I didn't know what to do, because it seemed... I did. That was 2 weeks ago. But I just sat there and in the chair that I was reading, and I put the book down, and I just really couldn't move for about 10 minutes, or even I didn't know what to say, what to think. I thought, this is so stunning. Why hasn't it been brought forth since 1988?
That's a good question, and this individual called into the program. He seemed very credible. I gave him an email address, and I asked him, hey, with me. I didn't come in, but I know that there were probably other people on the island at the time. And the thing is you have to, take into consideration, this is a fantastic story. But there are a lot of stories like this out there, and surprisingly, this story may not be quite as unique as it seems, in the sense that I don't mean to diminish the incredible effect that it has, but the point I'm making is that there are a lot of UFO stories like this. Many of them have been cataloged in the book by Mr. Robert Hastings, UFOs and Nukes, who I corresponded with during the time I was writing this essay. I asked him. I said, Robert, have you heard about this incident particularly, or any other incidents that took place, on some of these military bases, in the South Pacific and places nearby? And he knew of a few. He didn't know of this specific incident, but he sent me a chapter, very graciously, very nice of him to do that. He sent his book may be of interest and help to you, but sure enough, this was just, again, one of many incredible stories, that occurred, with regard to UFOs appearing or something strange. We don't know if it was a UFO. For all I know, it could have been some sort of a strange momentary opening of a black hole or something like that over a military base. I sincerely doubt that. I think the physical repercussions of something like that would be, far more detrimental to our health here on Earth, and we probably wouldn't be here in all likelihood if something that extraordinary had occurred. But whatever the case may be, there are dozens, if not, hundreds of stories just like this that occur. And I was just lucky enough to come across yet another. So it is very interesting that it hasn't been reported. But, again, I think that two things kind of contribute to why stories like these aren't reported. A lot of people like to lean towards there being a conspiratorial angle, that there's someone covering up, stories of UFOs and things like that are occurring, especially in military bases. But I think it's perhaps more likely that often when something so extraordinary happens, people experience it, and strange though it may sound, after this is, transpired, that it literally is something that is so mind-numbing, as you had described after reading it. It's so startling that you say, what do we do with this? And I think there's a stark potential for the human mind to cope with things that are so extraordinary by literally dismissing them, and that's why we do see so much dismissal of the study and the serious discussion of UFOs by the mainstream media and the scientific community as well.
Well, you brought up two things there. You said actually there's a lot more of these stories around than what you think. Well, I and probably a lot of people listening here are not aware of these stories. Why? Because the mainstream media and the conventional sources of information we get don't talk about it, because we can't explain it. And this is what the second point here is. This is what science does, and human nature too. When we come across things we can't explain, we kind of sweep it under the carpet and kind of move on and obsess with things we know a lot about or partly about, and go from there. Wouldn't you agree?
I think so. I certainly think so, and I think that again, it's a tendency to treat stories like this like water cooler information, something that is novel and entertaining, because of its, bizarre quality and because of the strange nature of what's being proposed, when in truth there very well may be something, far more important. But maybe even I would go so far as to venture to say that there could be something of grave concern to us. And I think that, again, I always end up drawing attention to the work of Mr. Robert Hastings, not only because he's seems to be a very, very nice fellow, and of course he's been kind to me in terms of, correspondence and trying to help with my own independent inquiry into these sorts of reports and things, along with Stanton Friedman and others. But I think that Robert Hastings has done such a fine job outlining not only the fact that UFO craft, whoever or whatever may be piloting them and wherever they may actually originate from, these UFO craft have a tendency to take certain interest in military operations, and they tend to be attracted to military bases as well as power facilities, whether those be electrical power facilities, nuclear power facilities, all these sorts of things. In addition to that kind of interest, these craft, which again, appear to be intelligently controlled, in addition to that interest that they have shown in our operations with military operations and with nuclear power and things like this, some of the most important things, not only to our infrastructure, but to security systems and things like that on a country-by-country basis, they also have displayed the apparent ability to disable nuclear weapons and missiles that are in flight, as detailed in Robert Hastings' books. And although there was, there are many instances where there have been, missile test launches and things like that, where a UFO has appeared. Apparently, and this sounds like science fiction, but there are many documented reports and cases. These have even been brought onto programs, national news television programs, and things like the Larry King Live program. In fact, Hastings and several former Air Force and government officials appeared together on an episode of Larry King's program talking about this, where they literally have observed missiles being fired into the air during nuclear missile test launches, and these missiles have been suddenly disabled by either the presence of a UFO or even more dramatically, in a few instances, what appears to be a UFO craft, an unidentified craft, space something like disabling. So these have not only taken interest in our military actions, in our nuclear facilities, and other of great, importance in terms of security and whatnot, but they've also shown an apparent ability to disable weapons systems. And what the obvious implication there is that they seem to be concerned with our use of weapons and things that have potential for mass destruction.
Stanton Friedman was on this show a couple of years ago, Mika, and he was talking about Roswell, and he mentioned that there's a pattern where UFOs appears, and he said around the Roswell area, radar and nuclear testing and that type of thing. So there definitely seems to be an interest of where these things appear throughout all these reports and investigations that we find. There's a pattern. There definitely is a pattern there. I mean, they don't come and look at someone's picnic, do they? Or a sports game or something like that. When you're taking your dog for a walk, they seem to be drawn to weapons and technology and things of that nature.
And yes, and I think what that indicates to us is that in all likelihood, whatever these craft represent, and I say craft, and I use that very carefully because when it comes to the notion of there being actual aliens, I mean, obviously if these craft are intelligently controlled, there has to be something or someone, likely some sort of biological entity or obviously a group of entities that are, able to control these craft. Maybe several such groups. And popular, conventional ufological studies and literature, seems to suggest that there are ongoing interactions, a number of different races, perhaps, of alien beings. But the thing is, if we want to look at, hard scientific data, empirical evidence, and data collected and gathered by official organizations, as well as, the better of the civilian organizations, which sometimes I think, in honesty, do a better job than some of the military and government organizations that have officially led inquiry into the UFO phenomenon, what we tend to see is we see this kind of conventional notion of these alien beings and their appearances and their even alleged abduction of individuals. And I'm certainly not saying that that's not occurring, but I will say that there's very little hard evidence to back that up. That seems to be what's going on. That seems to certainly be what's going on. But in addition to, or rather, kind of compared alongside there being so little evidence, photographic or physical or otherwise, to denote the actual presence of alien beings that might resemble ourselves, there is, plenty of evidence that, that suggests that there are indeed UFO craft, whether that be photographs taken over the years. Many of them, I'm sure, are dubious, but the thing is that in addition to these UFO craft that have been seen, there are air traffic control recordings that, describe correspondence between flight traffic control and civilian pilots as well as military pilots describing strange unidentified craft they see in the skies. And then there are, of course, the military and intelligence organizations like the CIA, FBI, Air Force, U.S. military, and also those sorts of branches of intelligence and military organizations from other countries around the world that have led and have gathered official information regarding the perceived UFO phenomenon. So we do know that there are strange craft that are seen. They appear to be intelligently controlled. They do appear to have and utilize technology that far exceeds our own. Seldom are we able to put our finger on who actually pilots these. And again, although there's a lot of conventional information out there in ufology that talks about aliens and encounters with beings, again, those are kind of anecdotal in terms of the fact that there are witness testimonies, and we can rely on those to a certain degree, but then beyond that, we have to take what evidence we actually have. So I hope that makes sense to people. I'm not dismissing the idea of aliens. Clearly, someone or something is piloting these craft. I like to keep my mind open as to who that actually may be, whether they be, world governments, secret U.S. or other government test projects, indeed extraterrestrial alien beings from another, star system or another planet, or maybe something or someone that has the ability to kind of traverse dimensional realms from one dimension to another, and who is capable of literally entering and leaving our own in an instant. And that in itself could be another explanation as to the perceived invisibility when this craft that my friend, or this caller at very least, Stephen, told me about, when this thing appeared and then vanished, who knows, perhaps there wasn't cloaking technology there at all. Maybe this thing was literally opening a rent in space-time and entering another dimension. So it's a very complex phenomenon, and trying to understand all that, is indeed mind-boggling.
Yes, it is. Mika, was there any official report made by the military on this incident on Johnson Atoll in 1988?
None that I could find. And I did try and contact some of the folks who were stationed on the island, around that time. I was unsuccessful in obtaining information from people, because, it is a little difficult to track some of these people down, and it kind of ends up coming down to a process of, I know this person, and this person might know this person, and they might know two more people, and so on and so on. And it could literally take years to try and track down all the individuals I would hope to know who might have been stationed, on that island during that incident in question. But it isn't impossible, and so the ongoing inquiry, of course, no doubt will continue, and it would be interesting to speak with other people and again, attempt to try and verify that story, because it seems very incredible. The witness sounded credible, and the details the witness gave on the air that night were, though incredible, they seemed very legitimate. The descriptions of the island and everything that I was able to fact check and back up, they seemed clear, and everything seemed indeed just as the man who called himself Stephen had said. And that's just so often the case with these sorts of reports. You'll have one individual who'll come forward and say something extraordinary happened, and they'll give you all kinds of testimony and data and things to back up what they're talking about. But, it's surprisingly difficult beyond that to verify the events in question. And if there was ever any kind of an official report issued, I certainly don't have knowledge of that, and I doubt that I would probably be able to obtain knowledge of that.
Do you know of any military personnel that have been told not to say or report to the media on any incidents like this in your investigations over the years?
Yes, I've heard of things like that. I don't guess he would qualify per se as a military official, but Gordon Cooper, the former astronaut, had been, I think, at the time working with the Air Force prior to going on to work with NASA. And if I remember this correctly, he had been doing an operation on dry lake bed at one time prior to his career as an astronaut. And he'd been working with several individuals out in this dry lake bed in the desert, and they'd had cameras set up, and they were filming. I can't remember what the nature of the project was, but people can actually just get on YouTube, and they can look for astronaut Gordon Cooper talks about UFOs. There are interviews where he discusses this incident. They said that a little silver disc, a very stereotypical flying saucer, landed, and they were able to film it and photograph it. And they sent this film off to be processed and whatnot. And I think Cooper later lamented the fact that he didn't obtain good copies of the negatives or anything like that, because he said he never saw the film again. You hear stories like this time and time again, and there are many incidents. There were people involved with the alleged UFO crash at Roswell in 1947 who also claimed that they were, privy of some sort of life, several life forms that were brought back from this alleged crash, and that they were studied and examined. Many of these individuals said that they were basically told not to talk about this, and that, a couple of people said that there was a red-headed sergeant that came in, who was very, very, angry and intimidating, and had told many of them to be, silent about this. So that certainly happens. And then, of course, there's the civilian angle, where many people who are civilians claim that military officials show up on their doorstep and tell them not to talk about these sorts of things. And that gets kind of into the realm of the notorious Men in Black, who my good friend Nick Redfern has just written a book about.
Yeah, Nick was on the show talking about his book a few weeks ago, Mika. And that's another book. When I read his book, boy, it made my hair stand on end. And when I finished it, the first night I'd finished it, I couldn't get to sleep because I kept hearing things around the house. And I was a little bit scared that somebody would knock on my door, because now I'm opening the door on the Men in Black, and you're not supposed to, right? You're not supposed to talk about these guys. You're not supposed to do anything about it. And here I am broadcasting to the world and all over the internet, and Nick too, writing his book about the Men in Black. So it gets into your head a little bit, but that's another amazing book about all this type of thing. What is your take on? We'll talk about the U.S. military's capability on cloaking and invisibility technology. What do you know about that?
Well, what I do know is that there have been official attempts at trying to develop cloaking technology that sounds to me remarkably similar to what has been observed with regard to UFO craft and their apparent limitations when it comes to their invisibility technology, cloaking technology. And what I mean specifically by that is that we often see these UFO craft glowing at night. Well, how often is it that a UFO appears, actually? Anything could be a UFO, an unidentified flying object. But let's
and that's what we're saying. Yeah, who's mentioned the word aliens here on every single minute of the conversation or studies you do? It's an unidentified flying object. That's what it is. Someone please tell us what it is.
Yeah, someone please, yes. If you do know. In fact, there's an English researcher named Peter Thomson. I believe he's English. He may actually be from some of the surrounding area, but either way, I know he's in Europe. And Peter Thomson had postulated a number of theories about ancient technology and things like that, and the proposed appearance of what are called Vimanas in the ancient Indian Sanskrit texts and whatnot, and their similarity in description to conventional flying saucers and things. And he'd even posed the theory that maybe some of these craft that we see today are leftovers from some ancient technology. And I love the way that he phrased it on his website. He said, someone may have these craft today and not realize their origin or what they are. If you know anyone, and he puts this on his website, he said, if you know anyone who has access to one of these craft, please contact me, because there's a very, real and nuts and bolts approach that a lot of people take to what these UFO craft may be, and that's an interesting one. So, but anyway, getting back on point, UFOs, unidentified flying objects themselves, could be any number of things. Some of them indeed could be and very likely are secret military craft. And when it comes to the development of being my inquiry into this, which, really isn't as in-depth as some engineers and other researchers, might be capable of doing. I'm a journalist, and I write about these kinds of things, and I certainly don't claim to have, the background knowledge in particle physics and electromagnetism and manipulation thereof to be able to really explain every process to you. But what I do know is that these UFO craft often appear to glow at night. They tend to have a colored kind of glow. Sometimes it's described as green, sometimes it's pinkish or purplish. Sometimes it changes colors, and it sounds very much, and it's very similar, this is interesting to me, to a kind of manifestation that occurs just a few hours away from where I live in a location called Limble Gorge. The phenomenon in question is known as the Brown Mountain Lights, and these lights often will appear. They appear to contain colored globes of light that will appear. Sometimes they'll change color, sometimes they'll drift around, and our best guess is that they are some sort of a plasma very similar to ball of lightning. Now, what does this have to do with cloakingology? Well, I find it interesting that the current approaches that have been suggested in terms of how one might produce, cloaking technology involve what's called transformation optics through the use of metamaterials. Basically, these are physical materials that are able to behave unlike a lot of known physical materials and the like, and essentially allow for interesting electromagnetic processes and things like that to occur. And specifically, the kind of process we'd be talking about here would be allowing visible light, the visible light portion of the electromagnetic spectrum, to be bent around a physical object so that it appears invisible. It wouldn't actually be invisible; it would still be there. But what would is that the would look so don't disappearing. See directly through it. We are beginning to understand technology that would do this. But when we're talking about creating an electromagnetic field on the exterior of a craft that might be conducive to doing this sort of thing, I think that what would likely be a byproduct of that, depending on the system used and the way it was enacted, would be something along the lines of an ionization on the exterior of the craft, an electrical ionization or something that could result in a coronal discharge. At night, this would resemble, plasma, St. Elmo's fire, something like that, and it's probably, and I've had engineers propose this to me, that this is, in all likelihood, why some of these UFO craft appear to glow at night. They appear to be illuminated lights in the sky because they're probably utilizing some sort of electromagnetic effect that produces, a plasma-like ionization on the exterior of the craft. So it's funny because I think the very thing that may allow such craft, if they are indeed able to remain invisible at times, in the daylight, that could be the very thing that reveals their presence in the evenings as these colored, glowing craft. So it's interesting. And conventional aircraft, you can get online, you can research this sort of stuff right now. They've found that an ionization on the exterior of a craft actually has a lot of practical benefits. It'll help reduce drag when a craft is moving through the air and things like that. And interestingly, get this, it will prevent or at least help prevent the effects of an electromagnetic pulse, which is the very sort of thing that resulted from those nuclear tests down there at Johnson Atoll in 1962. So I find a lot of those things are interesting, and they kind of run tandem in a lot of circles, and certainly seem to be very conducive to operating a highly advanced aircraft, especially from another world potentially. And I'm certain in the next few years that we're going to be seeing a lot of these sorts of things implemented in our military and maybe even a few of our conventional aircraft because of the sorts of benefits I've described. And, the very things that we see UFOs doing right now, if indeed it involves some sort of optical trickery that results in invisibility or the apparent use of that, we'll probably have that technology within the next couple of decades at very least.
That's really interesting what you just spoke about there. Would you say that most UFO sightings occur at nighttime? What the percentage, do you know?
I don't know what that percentage is, but, an easy way to tally that up would just be to visit, the Mutual UFO Network website. It's MUFON. I believe the website is MUFON.org, and I can check that real quick. But the easy way to do that would literally just be, look at the number of reports, and you could put together a very simple estimate of that. Actually, I don't think it's .org. We're looking at MUFON.com. So the Mutual UFO Network basically does a fantastic job gathering reports of UFOs as they occur. Many are reported almost in real time and plotted on Google Maps so that you can see where they're occurring. You can look for trends and things like that. I would wager, however, though, based on what I've said and based on just the general kind of reports that I've read over the years, that indeed the majority of UFO sightings, although there are certainly daylight sightings that appear to show metallic craft, and they've even been filmed before on many occasions. I guess taking into consideration every now and then that there are the misidentifications of weather balloons and the like from time to time, I certainly would probably venture to say that the majority of UFO sightings do take place at night. And it's interesting because sometimes you'll see craft that appear to have illuminations on them. For instance, we have these large triangle craft that are often described as being seen at night, or sometimes they're chevron-shaped. I've spoken to many individuals, who personally have seen these things to me. My own father described seeing a chevron-shaped craft that was very dark and moving completely silently over a valley here in western North Carolina. Again, right over this part of western North Carolina where I live, within a mile of my headquarters here, there was a sighting of one of these things. But these triangle craft often are seen and described as being very dark. They have illuminations, almost like landing lights or something like that on the 3 points. Whereas the more kind of out of this world, the saucer-shaped, disc-shaped, cigar-shaped craft and some of these things that are seen from time to time, and some of them literally just appear to be amorphous blobs, these kind of craft indeed tend to glow. And, of course, if it's night and it's dark and therefore if you have some sort of an electromagnetic ionization or something on the exterior of a metallic craft that you're piloting, it's going to pretty quickly betray your presence, and therefore I think a lot of these sightings would have to occur more frequently in the evenings.
Mika, did you ever see that incident that was shown live on Fox News with Megyn Kelly, where some strange light was hovering over the center of Jerusalem? I don't know if it was above the temple or not. I can't recall. I watched the video once on YouTube. And this thing just shot way up into the sky so fast. And Megyn Kelly was the host here in the United States, and she had her contact over there, reporter. And she said, "What was that? I don't like being scared." And it clearly rattled her. Did you ever see that incident?
I did, and that was a fascinating incident to me. In fact, actually, I did an interview with a fantastic fellow from the UK yesterday named Howard Hughes, who has a web program, and he deals with UFOs as well, and we were talking about that very same film. I spent a lot of time looking into that one, and a friend of mine, a good friend of mine actually, a correspondent from Mexico, and we were spent a lot of time to understand what was going on with that. In all likelihood, we have to accept that it probably was a very well orchestrated hoax, but I was fascinated by the first 2 videos that came out with regard to, because what we seemed to see was, indeed a light. It was hovering. It was over the Temple of the Mount in Jerusalem. Several individuals were standing there filming. You see this object descend over the temple. It hovers over the temple. Then there's a flash of light, and it takes off directly up into the sky, and then there's this colored pattern that seems to be happening up in the sky directly above them. Now, if indeed it was a hoax, it was incredibly well orchestrated. And what's fascinating to me is that there were 2 angles where the audio and the movement of the object, could be synced accordingly, very, very easily, in fact, and many people on YouTube did this. The second piece of footage having been filmed from a cell phone camera, and you can see in the first video a man standing there in the foreground where the videographer, we'll call him, in the first video is standing there filming. You'll see this man in the foreground holding the camera, filming this object as well. So the first 2 pieces of footage were compelling to me, for whether or not it was a fake, because if it was real, there's that corroborative, evidence in terms of 2 people filming from multiple angles at the same time, all the audio synced properly. You could even hear the voices that were more distinct in the first video were less distinct, but could be matched to the second video because of proximity to the actual location of the device that was being used to record. In other words, the man who was filming with the video camera in the first video could be heard in the background on the second video, and all this matched up and could be properly aligned. So that doesn't rule out a hoax. Somebody could have very easily thought this out, and using computer-generated graphics could have hoaxed this kind of thing. But it was fairly remarkable. Conversely, if it wasn't a real UFO, if it was a hoax, that people had actually managed to do this and do it so well. Now, a number of the videos that came out that were purported to be the exact same thing, filmed from different locations around Jerusalem the same evening, they were clearly hoaxes. One of them actually used a still image that was taken of Jerusalem at night with the Temple of the Mount there in the center. This image was available on Wikipedia.com, and if I remember correctly, was in the public domain, and somebody actually took that image still, applied a shaky cam kind of feature from a video editing program to this still image, and then used Photoshop, or probably not Photoshop, actually, it's probably some sort of a computer graphics CGI simulation program to insert this craft, the light and the appearance of the light, and then have it take off. And people were fooled by that. It was a still image, where the camera angle appeared to be shaking around, and people actually thought it was live footage over Jerusalem. So they say third video appeared when really it was quite obviously a hoax. I think that many of the other pieces of footage that showed allegedly something over Jerusalem that night were probably hoaxes, but the first two nonetheless were interesting. And there were some, the witnesses did come forward. One of the individuals who claimed to be the original cameraman came forward and spoke about that. A number of, I think he may have even appeared on at least a couple of radio programs and things like that, or videos online after the video appeared. So it was very fascinating. I can't say whether it was indeed real or not, but it certainly seemed to be something fantastic. And if it was real, again, we do see a very bright, glowing aircraft seen at night over Jerusalem, like so many of these UFO reportings seem to involve.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong here, Mika, but when I watched that video, I took it as it was being beamed live to the Fox News studio, and Megyn Kelly was discussing this object with her reporter live in Jerusalem. Am I mistaken in what I saw when I watched that video?
As I understand it, the video, the actual video appeared on YouTube, was uploaded, and then subsequently within, very least, a few days, but possibly maybe, within 24 hours, there was a second video uploaded. Now, if you saw it on Fox News, to the best of my ability to understand, I don't think that there was a live feed that would have been occurring with Fox News. If something like that had happened, that would have been extraordinary. Unless I'm thinking of a different incident that's something that I don't know about. But as I understand it, the video that was shown had been pre-recorded, and they were giving commentary on that on Fox News.
Perhaps. Well, certainly, I know from Megyn Kelly's reaction, she was spooked.
Mm-hmm.
So,
that's interesting.
Yeah. You could tell it bothered her. She says, I don't understand what that was. Words to that effect. But I do think she said, I don't like being scared. So in any case, that was an interesting one. What other UFO incidents have really encapsulated you?
Well, there have been a number over the years that I've been very interested in. Going back all the way to John Keel, for instance. He authored, of course, the Mothman Prophecies, and although there was what appears to be some cryptozoological, some unknown animal or creature or entity that apparently had the ability to fly, that was seen in the and actually it's interesting because a lot of the reports, and this is something I think that needs to be taken into consideration. There were eyewitness descriptions of the Mothman as being, and I'll get to how this pertains to ufology here in just a moment, but I do want to draw this distinction. There are eyewitness reports of what the Mothman apparently resembled. They said it was a large human-like, being. It may not have had a head as oriented like a typical person would describe seeing, a head resting on top of two shoulders. They said that the face on this being appeared to be oriented more closely to where the chest region on a large, well-built man would appear, and that there were large red glowing eyes like this. So although that sounds very strange, it really, in essence, kind of sounds more like an owl-like creature or some sort of a large bird. If you look at the news reports from that period that describe the Mothman creature, a lot of these reports do describe something that is described as being more bird-like, and some of the sightings in the Point Pleasant, West Virginia area and the surrounding region from that period flat out do describe birds, just very large birds. What I find interesting is that, and even John Keel noted this later, and I think there are a lot of modern researchers that would try and argue with me about this, but John Keel, the man who wrote the book and prolifically documented the presence of some strange creature, or as I will point out here, some strange creatures, plural, in the region at the time, Keel even came back to question the reports of the description of this alleged Mothman. I'm not saying that there wasn't something with wings that was seen in the area, but I know that one of the very first witness reports, the Scarborough family, these individuals have been driving along near the famous abandoned T&T factory there at the in Point Pleasant, along with another couple in a car one evening. Later, that report would come out and say that this being was flying after them, that this being had flown, and that it had wings and was able to keep up with their car as they were traveling along at tremendous speeds. But what's interesting is that I think it was the Pacific Stars and Stripes newspaper that the following day carried the story. I guess Mary Heyer was the reporter who was the correspondent who actually wrote the report. These individuals, they were young couples, they went to the police station, they filed a report the next morning, and they described this thing that had followed them, but the newspaper reported the following day that the creature had been able to keep up with them at tremendous speeds, and then the following quote was interesting to me. It said, and it was a clumsy runner. Now, what I think this shows is, just as John Keel began to surmise later on, although later testimony from those individuals described that this creature had flown, there was certainly a terrestrial, land-based component that had to be taken into consideration here. And Keel himself even began to say it was very clear that we were dealing with both, reports of something that flew, as well as what he called an abominable swamp slob, which is essentially, John Keel's own kind of lingo for what we would call a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch these days. And it is interesting that if you look through a lot of the reports of creatures that were seen, there were creatures that were described as bird-like that were seen flying, and then there were also large creatures with glowing red eyes that were seen shuffling around on the ground and moving on the ground that were perceived as being maybe this Mothman creature, but they were never seen taking off and flying. And I think what ends up happening is that there's an urban legend aspect to this where witness reports kind of come and go, and we begin to draw parallels between all these different strange phenomena that were occurring in that area at that time that Keel was in the area. And we begin to kind of tie them all together, and it all kind of gets lumped into being one thing, when in truth there were probably some winged creatures that were seen in the area. Maybe they were just large birds that were misidentified. Maybe there was something truly anomalous. There were also reports of something like a Bigfoot in the area. And what drew, as I understand, John Keel to the location, interestingly enough, were reports of some of these glowing, colored, kind of almost amorphous lights seen in the sky around Point Pleasant at the time, which lent a lot of people to kind of, speculating as to whether the Mothman creature or that alleged Mothman creature or anything else strange seen in that area at the time could have been the product of some UFO craft or extraterrestrial presence in the area. Just as I find it interesting that, indeed, there's a UFO element associated with the popular Mothman legend, which, as I've, hopefully illustrated here for folks, is probably far more complex on a cultural and a sociological level than most people realize. And a recent study came out that actually talked about how peer pressure from a group of individuals that witness any event tends to influence the way that people will recount what they feel that they witnessed. And the study involved people, literally being asked questions about something. They would answer correctly, and then they would come back later and be asked to recall the same sorts of things, but they would be fed phony answers that they were, led to believe their peers had given about the same incident. And the individuals who had answered correctly during the first study would nonetheless answer incorrectly during the second example, because they thought that their friends were changing their stories, and people in these studies would be found to kind of conform their own beliefs and their quote-unquote memories based on what their friends claimed to remember. And this happened about 70% of the time. So, I wonder, again, with regard to Mothman and Bigfoot or anything else seen in the area of Point Pleasant, around the time John Keel was there in the late 1960s, and some of these reports carrying on up into the early 1970s, I wonder how much of it, was that kind of sociological pressure that occurred. But what we do know is that there were indeed reports of UFOs in the region at the time, and there have been, and they've continued for years. And so, marking the progression of UFO reports and their involvement with strange phenomena and their appearance in conjunction with reports of Bigfoot and strange creatures and things like that over the years is something that's fascinating to me. And in a lot of ways, sociologically, it's even more, impressive to me to look at it like that as opposed to just focus on a singular UFO report. And although I know that you asked about what other singular UFO reports are fascinating to me, I think almost any of them that you look at, you can usually kind of tie them in with other strange and things that like that. And that, to me, is truly fascinating.
It was interesting to hear that story there on Mothman. That's how myths and legends are born. Stories
and again,
twist and they bend and shape along the way, don't they?
And it's not, of course, again, to try and detract from the idea that there was something that was described just as conventional wisdom would have us believe the Mothman was supposed to appear. But I don't think you can rule out the notion that indeed people's opinions and their ideas, and then as time goes on, you know, their memory, or rather their ability to remember what had occurred, and then the influence that those memories from others have on, you know, any other individual's memories of that event. You can see that these things compound and change over time, and people influence one another, and by the time something comes together in the end, it could be wholly different from what occurred. Clearly, I think something extraordinary happened. I don't buy the skeptical notion that there was, you know, a barn owl or a sandhill crane that was being seen at the time. You know, and I think, frankly, to say that, you know, something that could terrify people so badly was just a barn owl is quite absurd. There was clearly something rather anomalous going on, but I'm not certain that it was one singular phenomenon that represented a large anthropomorphic creature with wings and red eyes. I think it could have been a number of things that over the years have just been compounded, and yes, this could indeed have contributed to what we perceive as one thing that could have very well been another or several other things.
Well, in a universe with over 100 billion galaxies known at this point, anything is possible.
It certainly is.
When you start thinking of the universe and the grand scale of things, I mean, there's an estimated 400 billion stars in the Milky Way galaxy. And then there's another 100 billion galaxies. We don't really talk about that much, the size and scope of where we are in the universe, but because your mind, it can't comprehend it. It's just too big. And people say, well, it doesn't matter. Of course it matters. Of course it matters. When you're going, when you're going to your work or your home or you're traveling somewhere, you have to have a point of origin to get to your destination, or you're kind of lost along the way. And I think so many people ignore the fact of where they are in this grand dimension, this planet that's just floating out there. And when you look at the universe with an open mind, anything is possible. And if the theory that this dimension never ends, then everything is possible. It's a certainty.
I agree with you. Yes, I certainly agree that virtually anything that could be imagined, human or otherwise, possibly does exist somewhere. Maybe not here on Earth, but certainly could exist someplace. And of course, when it comes to this lonely planet, to borrow another of John Keel's terms, I think that there's probably more going on here on Earth alone than we realize. And Sandy, I have to say, I think it's hilarious sometimes that I hear scientists and cosmologists and people discussing how within the next few decades we're going to find life on other planets. I think that there's other life here on Earth that has yet to be discovered. There's at least a distinct possibility that there is life here on Earth that is not of this Earth. And, here we have these very serious cosmologists. They're willing to accept the idea of alien beings, but they're not willing to accept the notion that we're being visited right now. And if they aren't from another planet, that they are crypto-terrestrial beings from right here on Earth that may be unknown to us, or that there could be an interdimensional presence that is literally, and acting within, our atmosphere and our landscape, in a physical way, and our oceans for that matter, because of the number of UFO sightings that pertain to water and large bodies of water. I think it's hilarious that people are looking so far out and trying to get these telescopes and things. I mean, yes, space exploration is fine, and I'm an advocate for that and for, expanding our knowledge base and our understanding of science, but it's hilarious to me how far out people are willing to look, to find that almighty contact with, some other intelligence, unlike ourselves. In all likelihood, we're going to find it here before we go anywhere else and manage to discover it there.
The answer's always, usually right in front of your face. But it can't be because it's so simple. Have you, you mentioned there about alien life here on Earth. There is the ancient astronaut theory, as you probably know, which was highlighted in that brilliant television series, Ancient Aliens. What's your take on the content that was in that television show that broadcast on the History Channel not so long ago?
I like that program a lot. I will say that I've seen what I consider to be some sort of credulous arguments, but that's for a number of reasons. And it's not always that the information presented is bad. I think what it is that, you know, for entertainment purposes, when a program goes out and they are they have to have so much content, and there is so much good content that appears on that program. You know, within the really, I mean, if it's an hour-long show, giving, you know, commercials and things like that, a lot of the time you end up with about, you know, 45 or 50 minutes of actual airtime, and there's just not enough room in that period to cover all the background behind a lot of these, you know, otherwise what become kind of anecdotal pieces of evidence and things that are put forth on that program. And so it's easy to criticize the show when you aren't able to look into the backstory behind things. Now, that may not be the case in every instance. Everything may not be verifiable. But point out to people that program, although there's a lot of good information, and there are a lot of well-known researchers, you know, Giorgio Tsoukalos, Eric von Daniken, you know, even George Norrie and David Hatcher-Childress, you know, a lot of people who are very well respected in the field and who really know, you know, really the ins and outs of whether it be ancient astronauts or, you know, present extraterrestrial studies, all this sort of stuff. But the thing is that, you know, the program is a television program. It is entertainment. And within that context, it has to be taken, you know, for what it is. But indeed, you know, the experts that appear on the program are some very, very, very intelligent individuals, people who have taken a lot of time to research this sort of stuff, and they have a lot of brilliant ideas. But what I recommend to people is that, you know, don't get all your ideas solely from Ancient Aliens. You know, when you see these people, when you see David Hatcher-Childress, or you see Eric von Daniken, or you see one of these people, you know, on that program talking about ancient mysteries, you know, look into them deeper for yourself. Go get the books, you know, that were written by the people who appear on that program, and really, you know, peel through their, you know, every layer of the proverbial onion, so to speak, you know, for yourself. Read their books, you know, go in depth with the theories that are being discussed on that program, and formulate your own educated opinions based on that. You know, I love when people, as a matter of fact, here's an example, for instance. You know, I've been fascinated with what was called the Die Glock, which is a bell-shaped object that the Nazis had used in Germany, allegedly during World War II. Now, there is a distinct likelihood that there was indeed some project going on. It may have had to do with anti-gravity, and there's some far-out theories as to it having to do with time travel and things like that as well. But what really piqued my interest is that after studying this stuff for years, my grandfather, who's in his 90s now, and he's, you know, basically in an assisted living situation, my brother and I went to visit him recently, and he literally told me, just anecdotally while we were discussing Nazi technology, because he was a kind of a World War II historian of sorts, he mentioned, and, you know, the Nazis were working on anti-gravity technology and the like. And I thought, boy, that's interesting. And that was as far as it went on that occasion. So I had to go back, meet up with Granddad, and asked him, you know, Granddad, where did you come across that information about anti-gravity information and the Nazis being involved with this? And I wondered if maybe, you know, one of his contacts over the years had told him something, or maybe if he had a book that dealt with this. And, you know, his answer was this. He says, oh, well, you know, I've seen this on television programs, and it's fairly well known that this occurs. Now, what I'm saying here is not that this is bad information, but that a lot of people, as you can see, even, you know, a World War II historian will gather a lot of their information from television programs and things. And a lot of these, you know, utilize accredited sources and things. But I prefer when you hear this information, if it's presented on a program, find out who's talking about it and go read what that person says, and don't take just the peripheral, opinion, so to speak. So when it comes to Ancient Aliens, fantastic program. I enjoyed it. It's very good, enlightening content, but it is a television program, and I say go read those authors and enjoy their work and the true breadth of their knowledge base, which one program alone certainly can't cover entirely.
Indeed, indeed. Well, we've come now to the end of our segment here, Micah. Thank you very much for coming on to the show here today and talk about your contribution to the anthology UFOs and Aliens. Is there anybody out there? Do you have any final comments or words of wisdom for the audience?
I certainly do. They ask, is there anybody out there? We don't know who they are, where they're from, but they are certainly there. And I hope that this book will do a good job in exposing, not only exposing, uncovering, and declassifying, but exposing, other people to what I think is, a collection of essays from people at the forefront of modern ufology. I'm very proud to be a part of it. And you can always learn more about that at newpagebooks.com, or you can visit my website, which is the Gralien Report, and that's www.gralienreport.com. Come check it out, and if you have questions, you can always email me, info@GralienReport. I'll do my best to answer those questions for people as well.
Great stuff, great stuff. Thank you very much, Mika, for coming onto the show. Have a great day.
You too. It's my pleasure.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to the Universal Learning Series radio show, where we discover the spiritual and scientific universe.